Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and one of the most sensitive issues within the Jewish community deals with the way in which Judaism operates inside the state of Israel. Clearly, Israel is the nation state of the entire Jewish people. Every Jew should be comfortable and feel at home in Israel, whether they're observant or not, no matter how observant they are or not, whether they're Orthodox or not. But the reality is that for historical purposes, for political reasons, Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, made a deal with the Orthodox Rabbinate, the Orthodox establishment, and he handed over to the Orthodox establishment, which has always been to a large extent on the extreme right of Orthodoxy in Israel. Ben-Gurion gave to the Orthodox establishment control over issues of personal Jewish status, meaning that when it comes to matters of conversion, marriage, divorce, to who qualifies as a Jew in Israel, these matters are under the control of the Orthodox establishment, the Orthodox Rabbinate of Israel. And so the office of the chief rabbi has historically determined such issues as who is a Jew in the state of Israel, whose conversions will be recognized as valid in the state of Israel, who is a rabbi authorized to officiate at a Jewish wedding ceremony or to write a get, a Jewish bill of divorce. I should also mention that the official Orthodox Rabbinate of Israel determines which rabbis will be paid by the state of Israel and which synagogues and religious institutions will receive funding from the state of Israel. Well, for a long time, American Jews who've grown up in a pluralistic Jewish community where Orthodoxy is only one expression of Jewish life and by and large the smallest Jewish community within American Jewish life, where there are conservative Jews and Reform Jews, Reconstructionist Jews, and myriad Jewish groups of smaller movements or of a wholly independent nature, chavurot, minions, and the like. And in America, there's a profound understanding of how Jewish peoplehood embraces many, many Jews who, while being secular and either wholly or partially non-observant, they're deeply involved in Jewish life, committed to the state of Israel, committed to the well-being of the Jewish community, and enormously committed to Jewish social welfare organizations and institutions that promote Jewish life. And as a result, many American Jews, especially non-Orthodox rabbis, have been offended by the way in which the laws of the Jewish state of Israel have relegated non-Orthodox expressions of Jewish life and non-Orthodox institutions and non-Orthodox rabbis to less than second-class Jewish stature in Israel. And it has been pointed out time and time again, there's a painful reality, irony, in the fact that Israel is the only place on earth where Jews often feel they must leave the country in order to be married in a ceremony with the rabbi of their choosing, in a Jewish ceremony that reflects their own sense of Jewish identity. Well, there are many wonderful voices in the Jewish world today speaking out against this political reality of Israel, and none has been more eloquent or effective than has the voice of my guest on this edition of L'Chaim. It is a real pleasure for me to present to you Uri Regev, President and CEO of Hiddush, Freedom of Religion for Israel, an educational and advocacy effort that works in a partnership between Jews of Israel and Jews of the diaspora. And if you're meeting Uri Regev for the first time, let me tell you a little bit about him and his extraordinary career. Uri Regev served for 7 years as president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, a global umbrella organization that represents the Reform and Reconstructionist movements. Prior to his work with the World Union, Uri was the founding chair of the Israel Religious Action Center of the Reform Movement. And it was as its legal counsel that Uri Regev helped win an historic victory in the Israeli Supreme Court on the question of who is a Jew. And Uri, it is so wonderful to have you sitting at this table. You know, I told you, I am a real fan of yours. You've been an extraordinary presence and voice on the world Jewish scene now for years and years. It's an honor having you sitting at this table. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, and the pleasure is mutual.
Thank you so much. I want only one little moment about you. Where were you born?
I was born in Tel Aviv, and I made Aliyah to Jerusalem as I entered Hebrew Union College to study for the Rabbinate.
So you're a Sabra.
Yes.
And you decided to become a Reform rabbi in Israel.
I have.
Okay, it's just so, you were one of the first. What motivated you? What was your family setting that you grew up in that Uri Regev would decide to become a Reform rabbi in the state of Israel?
Well, indeed, my late mother would have rather seen me settle comfortably in a law firm because I'm also an attorney by training. But it's interesting to realize that it's exposure to America as a 16-year-old exchange student coming here for 6 months, going to camp.
Which camp?
Camp Kutz first, and then in the West Coast,
Camp Swing. In the Reform Movement.
In the Reform Movement. And the Shabbat experience at camp, and the first awareness that I had as a native-born Israeli to the notion that in Judaism as well, it ain't necessarily so. Namely, seeing religious pluralism in action. It's not that I buying everything that I was exposed to, but it was a transformational experience for me that upon returning to Israel, and again I was 16-year-old, it put me in a direction of seeking my own path to Jewish renewal, to Jewish creativity, and one thing led to another, and I found myself at the Hebrew Union College.
I understand completely. You obviously came back as a 16-year-old, and you ultimately went into the service as every Israeli young person, correct?
Correct. And I served for 5 years in the Judge Advocates Division, retiring from the Army with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel.
Okay. Then you went on to become a lawyer?
No, actually, I studied law before entering into the military service in something like the ROTC.
I see.
So I studied in law school and then went into the army and served as military prosecutor of the Israeli Navy and assistant legal advisor in Gaza and Sinai.
Was that a fascinating time for you?
It certainly was. But I have to say that throughout most of the military service, I was able to also immerse myself in Jewish studies, in Jewish philosophy and Talmud at Tel Aviv University. So getting out of the army, the path was quite clear, and I found myself going into Hebrew Union College.
In addition to this experience, when you came as a 16-year-old and you know, your eyes were open to an American-style Jewish pluralism, do your parents get any credit for who you became in this regard?
Well, I have to add one more thing before I speak about my parents, and that is the year was 1967. Very special year in so many respects. One of the formative experiences that I had there was this was the height of the civil rights era. The songs we sang were "We Shall Overcome," "Let Me Be a Little Meeker," "What You Do When You Wanted a Town," "When You Needed a Town," etc. And the combination of Jewish autonomous creativity and liberal Judaism on the one hand, and tikkun olam and social justice rooted in a commitment to civil liberties, came together in the fact that I created the Israel Religious Action Center with the motto of a human equality, social justice, and religious tolerance. Now, my parents and my family background was quite typical in terms of people of my age growing up in Israel. Namely, my late grandfather, who passed away when I was quite young, was Orthodox. My parents were already secular. Bar mitzvah, Passover Seder, eating Homen Taschen on Purim and Ponchkes on Chanukah, but they were very supportive of my choice. So there was no resistance at home, and they would have liked to see me settle more comfortably economically,
Of course.
but were very
Right.
supportive of my reform
Okay.
choice.
By the way, I want to press you just one more moment.
Yes.
Okay. You talked about the quality of observance in your home, where your grandfather was Orthodox and your parents basically rejected it and became secular.
Yeah.
But was there this social action commitment that's in your soul that has expressed itself through Iraq and then through all the work you've done with, in trying to encourage and develop Jewish pluralism in the state of Israel? It comes from a sense of Jewishness and Jewish values. Were your parents, in America we also often talk about Yiddishkeit, whatever that is. Yeah. But was there a sense that you had from them when you talk about, you talk about Tikkun Olam? I have a problem with the concept, but the word, I understand the concept. Was that something that they were, or did they sort of learn that from their young son?
If these are the two options, I would say that probably the latter.
Interesting.
Namely, I am the one that uncovered layers of Judaism that they were not conscious of, at least not knowingly. Because it isn't that they rebelled. They were the typical Israeli secularists who basically opted for the secular category as a default option, not wanting to pursue an observant mode of life and not being aware of the alternatives. My growing up in an either-or environment made most Israelis opt for the or. If you're either religious, as in Orthodox, or secular, I'm secular.
Incidentally, that is the experience I have found in so many Israeli situations. It's the either or. If I have to choose one or the other, I will choose the or. And what you've described for yourself as a 16-year-old, and I'm older than you, and I've been, doing this for a long, long time. We've both been doing this for a long, long time. But in addition to sitting here at Shalom TV, I have a chavurah that I've been with for 42 years. And one of the things that is amazing to me is that every now and then, Israelis will, for one reason or another, be attending the chavurah. And it's what you've described. It is eye-opening in the sense that the alternatives that are available in this spectrum of real Jewish life, which are here in America but have not been in Israel for political reasons, and we'll talk about that in a moment, has been refreshing to the Israeli. And so often I will have people from Israel tell me how wonderful it is to experience the Chavurah or other non-Orthodox forms of Judaism, and then go back to Israel with, as you say, eyes opened, and it's a new world for them. So it is really so honest to hear you describe how this was true for your parents, and you in some way helped them see a broader section. Talk for one more moment now about this generally, and now we're heading towards the Israeli scene. To what extent is what you experienced as a child, what your parents experienced as adults, still the norm in Israel? To what extent is there still the necessity to bring the notion of Jewish pluralism to the average Israeli Jewish household?
I think the Jewish scene in Israel has transformed itself from the time that I was growing up in a number of ways. I can give you sort of a token expression and proof of what I'm saying. Of course, you know that Rav in Hebrew is rabbi in English. But when I started being involved in the reform movement, the media would refer to reform rabbis not as Rav, but as rabbi. So they would say rabbi in Hebrew. So they would refer to Orthodox rabbis as Rav and to reform rabbis as rabbi. Nothing of the sort anymore. Not only is the media treating non-Orthodox rabbis with respect and a sense of acceptance as legitimate rabbis, but female rabbis are now seen as an not only legitimate but often desirable addition to providing programming on Jewish values and on Jewish practice. So looking through the media and tracing it back to 67, 70, 75, and today, the media is open, interested in Jewish alternative voices.
And this obviously has an impact on Israeli society.
It has tremendous impact on Israeli society, and that's what I wanted to get to. And frankly, I think that in part, the work that we've done at the Israel Religious Action Center has helped that process, because it brought, you see, the Israel Religious Action Center was created to bring our vision of Judaism and of Israel to the streets, to the halls of power, to the courts, to the media. And the more Israelis realize this isn't about Reform Judaism tooting its own horn, this isn't about self-interest, this is about expanding the vision of what Israel's Declaration of Independence saw as the core Jewish identity of Israel, namely a state rooted in the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace as taught by the Hebrew prophets. This attempted to bring it alive. So what happens in Israel today is twofold. One, when in recent years studies were done, such as the IDI Avichai Foundation study of Jewish identity in Israel, at this point, approximately 9% of Israeli Jews in this study identify themselves as Reform or Conservative. Now, bear in mind, that's more or less the percentage of those who identify themselves as ultra-Orthodox. So this is no longer the misguided notion that we heard in the 60s and the 70s, namely the synagogue I don't go to has to be Orthodox, coming from secular Israelis, but rather an appreciation and acceptance to the point that obviously we don't have 9% as members of Reform and Conservative synagogues. But more and more Israelis are saying, you ask me what my Jewish identity is, you provide me with a spectrum that's Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, I'm Reform or I'm Conservative. Now the other interesting phenomenon is that
what was the percentage again?
9% in the Avichai Foundation study.
And your point is, although that may sound like a small number.
Oh, it's a huge...
reality is,
we are talking about 6 million Jews in Israel, so 9%, gee, that's a very significant percentage, comparable to the ultra-Orthodox community. But having said that, the interesting thing in Israel in terms of Jewish identity beyond the streams is that Israel has jumped into the post-denominational era before the denominational streams have really fully established themselves.
Meaning?
So for instance, if you come during the summer to Tel Aviv, there is this synagogue called Beit Tfilah Israeli, the Israeli house of worship, house of prayer. It's led by a South American rabbi who made Aliyah from Argentina, studied for the Rabbinate at Hebrew Union College, and is leading this non-denominational synagogue, which has Israeli composers composing liturgical music for them, which has a unique prayer book that combines traditional services with Israeli poetry, with readings, etc. And during the summer, July and August, they hold services in the Tel Aviv port, on the deck, by the water. And regularly on a Friday night, you will see 800,000 Tel Avivians.
How thrilling is this?
It is. It is exciting, with a band that accompanies the service. And it is an exciting experience because many of the people who come there are Tel Avivians who want to have a flavor of Judaism which respects their life choices.
Okay, and I want you to explain. To what extent are we talking about Sabras as opposed to American Jews who have made Aliyah?
Now, already in, I think, the 70s, there was a doctoral dissertation, or 80s, doctoral dissertation written by Professor Ephraim Tavori of Bar-Ilan University on the Reform and Conservative movements. Already then, his very thorough analysis showed that the Reform movement is not Anglo, that the majority of the members of the Reform movement are quite heterogeneous, true, not representative in the same percentage of Israeli Sephardic Jews, Middle Eastern, those who came from Arab countries, which is another question, but extremely heterogeneous and certainly not Anglo. So I think that that's a perception that some have. It is not an accurate perception. Somewhat more true regarding the conservative movement, but I think even in the conservative movement, you have a significant growth of indigenous Israeli
So estimate for me.
Yes.
What percentage of Jews in Israel who would be found in Reform synagogues are Sabras as opposed to American Olim?
I wouldn't attempt to quantify, but I will say if you come to Kedem Synagogue, to Beit Daniel, used to be Kedem when I was growing up, to Beit Daniel in Tel Aviv, and again, there are hundreds who come there on a Friday night for services. There are 1,000 plus on Tikkun Leil Shavuot or Simchat Torah, etc. Most of them would be Israeli-born young people, some older people, and the Anglos and their children, etc., would be a small minority.
Okay.
Small minority.
All right. So there has been progress made, hasn't there?
Dramatic progress in terms of Israelis' appreciation for alternative vision of Judaism, which, by the way, reflected itself also in a whole movement of secular Batei Midrash, of this concept of the Jewish bookshelf, and the Israelis reclaiming their right, their place in studying Jewish texts and interpreting them in a variety of ways.
Uri, I want to describe to you something I've been saying for many years, and I want you to tell me the extent to which you think I've had it right or wrong. I have argued that as long as the issue of Jewish pluralism in Israel was a matter that meant most to American Jews or American rabbis or American Jewish institutions across a sea, there would only be so much progress in the state of Israel, and by that I meant minimal progress. And that it ultimately would only change when Israelis, whether they're Olim or whether they're Sabras, but Israelis, the people who live inside Eretz Yisrael, the state of Israel, until the Israeli people themselves cared about a change in the way in which the Orthodox Rabbinate has a stranglehold on certain aspects of Jewish life, or how the Western Wall is administered or not administered. Until Israelis care, not what, I'm sorry, Jews, in the Reform movement here in America, or what, Rick Jacobs or Eric Yaakov or Julie Schoenfeld were. No, it had to be from within the Israeli people. And I want to know the extent to which you feel I'm right, and as you look at the historical movement that you now describe, to what extent is this really a product of a change of Israeli mentality, not imported or not a function of American lobbying pressure on Netanyahu or any other Israeli politician, but that it is an indigenous move that emanates out of the soul of the Israeli people themselves?
Generally speaking, I agree. I wouldn't be as harsh as describing that as an either-or proposition. I don't think that it's either Israelis or the streams. I think that what happens is, and you referred to me being one of the first graduates of the Israeli rabbinic program at Hebrew Union College. I was the fifth. By now, I don't know the exact number, but I assume HUC, Israeli rabbinic program, has ordained more than 70.
And we should just make sure our audience understands. HUC, the Hebrew Union College, is the rabbinical school of the Reform movement,
which has a
first
branch,
started in the United States,
a campus
and now it has
in Jerusalem.
A campus in Jerusalem.
Right. So I think that more than 70 have been ordained to date in the Israeli rabbinic program. Most of them are native-born Israelis. The interesting thing is that, like the rabbi who serves this Beit Filah Yisraeli, the Israeli house of prayer in Tel Aviv, there is a rabbi, female rabbi, Chen Tzfoni, who is in Nahalal in the Galil, also started her prayer group, also not affiliated with the Reform movement. So people like her represent a genuine growing interest among Israelis seeking a connection to Judaism, which is not orthodox. And Hebrew Union College, to its credit, I should say, has seen its role not only as being a denominational training ground, but also serving Israel's growing spiritual hunger and providing rabbis for non-movement purposes or non-movement circles. Now, you are 100% correct. And it brings me to the organization that I created with Stanley Gold of Los Angeles, who was the president of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation and chairman of the board of USC, etc., who is our chair. The vision that we had was really transcending the denominations. And we created Hiddush, which stands for the Hebrew acronym Chofesh Dat V'Shivyon, freedom of religion and equality, consciously and purposely as a non-denominational educational and advocacy group, because we felt exactly as you do. In some ways, the curse of the struggle for pluralism and religious freedom has been, it's for too long been identified with the reform and conservative movements alone. And therefore, we felt the need to create an added dimension for this effort that would be similarly comfortable and attractive from secular to orthodox. And the irony is that there are orthodox individuals, scholars, rabbis who support us because they believe, as I do, Israel will be more Jewish if there was no religious coercion. Israel would be more Jewish, more genuinely Jewish, more richly Jewish if religious freedom and equality became a reality. So secular and Orthodox alike, and of course Reform and Conservative, are part of our vision, which really conforms to exactly your observation.
I appreciate that. Incidentally, I want to make sure I'm clear both to you and to our audience. You know, I have enormous regard for Julie Schoenfeld. I think she does fabulous work. And Eric Yaffe is an extraordinary Jewish voice and a dear friend. And Rick Jacobs now picks up that mantle and is doing the same thing. And Arnie Eisen at JTS and David Ellenson for many years within the Reform movement. There are extraordinary American Jews who are speaking out in wonderful ways. But I have always felt, as you have said, that, and I don't mean to embarrass you, but the role you occupy as an Israeli, as a Sabra, who creates Hiddush as a way of saying to the people you grew up with and the people who you represent, which is different. Israel and America has a wonderful relationship. The whole idea of Israel and diaspora Jewry is really one. And the American Jew has this very romantic notion that in some way the state of Israel is theirs even if they don't live there, and even sometimes if they don't visit. But at the same time, for Israel to make the kind of steps, it was somebody like you and your voice. And this does not diminish Julie's or Eric's or anybody's. But the bottom line is the voice you have been able to provide in leadership to the non-Orthodox alternatives in Judaism has been a gift from heaven. And that's why I am thrilled that our audience gets to hear what you say, and no one is more eloquent than you. Now I want to ask you some of the tachlis issues.
Well, let me start with one tachlis issue, if I may, because it connects what you just said.
Okay, I'll let you go.
And some of the tachlis issues as who is a Jew. One of the landmark cases that I won in the Supreme Court of Who is a Jew included a particularly important opinion of the former Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, Professor Aharon Barak. And I think it'll be of interest to you and our audience.
Please.
He said, what does the state claim when they hold that Israel should not recognize Reform and Conservative conversions? What they maintain is that all Jews in Israel are part of the Jewish community, quote unquote, Ha'ida Yehudit. At the helm of this Jewish community religiously stands the chief rabbinate, and therefore if you want to be recognized as a member of the Jewish community, you need to have the approval of the chief rabbinate. That, he said, in a nutshell, is the state's argument. He says, we are not able and not willing to accept this proposition. He says, it is true that the concept, the label, Ha'ida Yehudit, the Jewish community, appears in Israeli law, but it dates back to the mandatory period, namely the British rule over Palestine, and has no place in the modern sovereign state of Israel. He says, the state of Israel is not the state of the Jewish community, quote unquote. It is the state of the Jewish people.
Oh, wonderful.
And this Jewish people has many movements and denominations and streams, and they are all part of that people that Israel is, their home was created for, and every Jew should be able, and he says for that matter, every person should be able to freely choose which they want to belong to and affiliate to. So the historic significance of this ruling has been, I think, not sufficiently recognized. What he says is more than who is a Jew. What he says is we need to come to terms with the fact that the old notion of Israel being the state of this Jewish community governed by the chief rabbinate Jewishly is obsolete. We in Israel, we the Supreme Court of Israel, have laid down our approach to this notion of a Jewish state. A Jewish state means a state of the whole of the Jewish people.
Klal Yisrael.
Exactly.
Okay. By the way, does this mean that Uri Regev wants the rabbinate abolished in Israel?
It's interesting. I ultimately feel that the notion of a chief rabbinate is not only not Jewish, because we never had a chief rabbinate, but worse yet, has been imposed on the Jewish community by the Turks, the Ottoman rule that wanted to have one sort of representative to the Jewish community, for the Jewish community, in what they created as a millet system, being tolerant of the different religious minorities that existed in the Ottoman Empire, and then inherited by the British, who created the office of two chief rabbis, Sephardic and Ashkenazi. It is ridiculous for the modern sovereign state of Israel to be governed by foreign notions that were created by the Turks and the British to suit their political needs. So, in principle, I am opposed to the notion of a chief rabbinate. I think that the notion of a chief rabbinate is particularly ridiculous in Israel because whose chief rabbinate is it? The ultra-Orthodox don't recognize the chief rabbinate as deciding for them. They all have their own respective rabbinic authorities. They decide who Israel's chief rabbis are going to be, and you could see it in the last elections when Rabbi Stav lost to Rabbi Lau Jr., and clearly a modern Zionist candidate lost, not because Rabbi Lau was considered to have greater attributes and knowledge, but because politicians ruled the process. So it's a politicized process which alienates both modern Orthodox, who see themselves sort of, excluded, and it alienates the secular because it's so corrupt and it's so anachronistic. And the ultra-Orthodox don't have much respect for it, even though they decide who is going to be in that position, because they choose second-class rabbis, because they don't want the chief rabbinate to be a sort of a competition to their circles of Torah interpretation. So all in all, it is anachronistic, it is irrelevant, and it is contrary to the notion of religious freedom and religious pluralism which characterize Jewish life throughout history.
So the answer is yes.
The answer is yes.
You'll be just as happy if there were no formal chief rabbinate in Israel.
Yes, I think the role of the rabbi is extremely important, and it should be the choice of rabbis by different groups on a voluntary basis, not imposed by the state through a political process.
By the way, there are many Orthodox rabbis who agree with you 100%.
Oh, sure.
100%. Many Orthodox Jews would agree with you. Okay. I want at the same time to try to articulate what someone who disagrees with you would say, and I want to hear how you answer. The largest problem, giving the alternative argument every benefit of the doubt, meaning that it is meant not as a form of subjugation, a form of sort of like acquiring power, but for the best of motives. The argument that is often advanced is the following. It is very important that there be a sense of Jewish peoplehood that embraces everybody. And that within the Orthodox world, there is a concern about a certain kind of, and I'm going to use a term that sounds bad, Jewish purity. What they mean by Jewish purity is that there are two halakhic ways to become a Jew. You're born to a Jewish mother, or you convert in a certain halakhic fashion. I don't want to say Orthodox, halakhic fashion. And the halakhic fashion demands for a male Torah study, Brit Milah, formal circumcision, and mikveh. And for a woman, it includes Torah study and mikveh, and it normally implies that the one who is converting is willing to state publicly and then commit publicly to an embrace of Jewish life. Not any Jewish life, but Jewish life of a more halachic nature. And from the Orthodox community's perspective, this is essential in maintaining the purity of the Jewish tradition. In addition, the one other thing that we should throw in here that people have to understand is that there's a concern within the traditional Jewish community of avoiding mamzerut, of avoiding the creation of Jews who are not enough Jews that if they were then to marry a Jew who does fit their requirements, the offspring of that child would have certain kinds of questions. And if a child is born of an adulterous relationship, and adultery here is not meant in a romantic or non-romantic sense. It's not a question of a paramour has sex with a man and the next thing you know they have a child. No. If a woman does not have a kosher, formal divorce, bill of divorce, a get, even though she may have the best of intentions and be married by another Reform rabbi or a conservative rabbi to a man she loves who and there's no bigamy, and as far as both people, there's no adultery. Classically, formally in Jewish law, if she did not obtain a kosher divorce from her first husband, whether she likes it or not, she's an adulteress because she is now married to a second man while married to a first man, which is forbidden in Jewish law. And that means any child she brings into the world from that second marriage is, from a classically halachic perspective, an illegitimate Jew. The word mamzer here does not mean mamzer in the classical vernacular sense. Mamzer. No, it's a technical word that means this child is Jewishly illegitimate, and then there's real problems as to who that mamzer may then marry. And what the Orthodox world is trying to say is, we have nothing against your wanting to be a Jew in whatever way you want to do. But when it comes to creating family and children, and a sense of Klal Yisrael, which will not only embrace the non-Orthodox, but will embrace the Orthodox as well. You can't ask me to give up my sense of Jewish family integrity. And as well-meaning as the Reform rabbi might be, or the non-Orthodox rabbi might be, what that rabbi and what that institution is doing is creating a problem of Jewish children who are not authentically, from a halachic perspective, from the Orthodox perspective, Jewish. And the only reason it matters, it's not because they're less human, they're less valuable, they're less lovely. They can be as lovely as can be. But the problem is they bring a taint of impurity into the Jewish family structure, which has practical consequences for generation after generation. And therefore, there has been within the State of Israel a ceding to the Orthodox establishment in the area of how do you determine who is a Jew based on a conversion, because the State of Israel said, for political reasons but also for Jewish reasons, we will go to the most all-inclusive definition, which must include and make happy those Jews who have this view of halakha and Jewish purity and how you create authentic Jewish children. And they would then say to you, Uri Regev, we appreciate everything you want to do. And you want to have non-Orthodox synagogues, and you want to have women rabbis. I was in the synagogue, the Reform synagogue of Modi'in, led by a wonderful woman rabbi. Okay, have it all you want, but when it comes to conversion and who is a Jew based on who is converted, how the conversion is done. And again, we're going to take the best of the argument. It's not about somebody trying to keep their little group of Orthodox rabbis in power. No. We're only going to talk about a process. The process of conversion must be halachic in an Orthodox framework. And we're asking you, Uri Regev, have everything you want when it comes to Jewish pluralism, but on this one issue, you must create a Jewish structure which is compatible with the overall Orthodox structure, or you are the one who is putting a knife into Klal Yisrael. That's the argument. I would love to hear Uri Regev's response.
Well,
How did I do, by the way?
You have done a great job in capturing the sort of establishment argument against religious pluralism, religious freedom.
That's not fair. It's not
Israel.
an establishment argument. This is the Orthodox traditional argument anywhere in the world.
Well,
anywhere in the world.
So let me say the following. This too is changing. A debate that I had with one of those rabbis who actually said what you say. He said, you want support for your synagogues?
Stop right there. By the
Yeah.
way, you're talking about Shlomo Riskin.
I am talking about Shlomo
And you were at
Riskin.
the American Jewish Committee's
Exactly.
Global Forum.
Right.
And we were fortunate enough to be able to be there and show it on Shalom TV.
Okay.
Basically, you're talking about Jewish pluralism with Shlomo Riskin. And you were arguing that when we have a communal discussion, both sides, both the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox,
Yeah.
must treat each other
Yeah.
as equals. You remember saying that?
Yes.
Equals. And
There's
that
no
one-
real dialogue when one of the partners
Right.
controls the other.
Right. And that one side cannot take the view that they are more authentically Jewish than the other.
Right. Oh, they can take the view, but that cannot be a real dialogue.
But basically, while you and Shlomo Riskin agree on so many things, on this one issue of conversion, that's where in this global forum by the AJC,
Yeah.
you could not get him to agree.
Wait. Let's separate the issues. First of all, what you will find, I have debated with Rabbi Riskin for many years.
And incidentally, he is on the very liberal end
Right.
of the Orthodox spectrum, and I love
That's
Shlomo
fine.
Riskin.
That's fine. All I'm saying is that there is a change that orthodoxy is undergoing, and therefore it's not. Let me suggest.
Please, okay.
Okay. So first of all, what you would find Rabbi Riskin saying, different from what he said all the years that we debated in the past, when he said exactly what you said. Just leave marriage and conversion in Orthodox hands. That's what's necessary in order to keep Jewish unity, etc., etc. What he said in the AJC Great Debate is Israel should recognize civil marriages. Israel should recognize non-Orthodox marriages.
He did say that.
Okay. Now, Rabbi Avi Weiss has recently written an op-ed in the New York Times, has written an op-ed prior to that in the Times of Israel, saying Israel should recognize freedom of marriage, should recognize civil marriages. In the Times of Israel, said Reform and Conservative.
You do understand how non-representative Shlomo Riskin and Avi Weiss is within the Orthodox world.
Wait.
But you do, right?
What I'm saying is more and more, Rabbi Daniel Hartman and others, more and more are supporting the notion that Israel needs to recognize freedom of marriage.
Okay.
Now you see the fallacy of the argument is proven by the following. What the chief rabbinate has done is refused to recognize Orthodox conversions in America. It's telling the American Orthodox Rabbinate, we'll recognize 2, 3, 4, 5 rabbinic courts throughout the country. All the other Orthodox rabbis, as far as we are concerned, are not legitimate participants in conversion courts. Let's take it to the next step. You may recall, a few years ago, there were cases of conversion done under the authority of Rabbi Druckmann. Rabbi Druckmann is the head of the Bnei Akiva Yeshivot. He was the head of the governmental conversion authority, certainly mainstream in what you describe as mainstream orthodoxy. The Rabbinic Court of Appeal, following a decision of the Rabbinic Court in Ashdod, said, you, Rabbi Druckmann, are too liberal. You don't insist on this notion of acceptance of the yoke of mitzvot, and therefore you are a rasha in halachic terms, evil in halachic terms, which means all your conversions are suspect. Now, the reality in Israel is, and if you follow the debate in the Knesset in the last 2 weeks, actually, General Elazar Stern, the Knesset member, has introduced a conversion bill that aims at expanding the scope of Orthodox conversions not to, fringe individuals, but to those who have been established and appointed as chief rabbis of cities, that they should be able to convert as well. Who is opposing it? The chief rabbinate is opposing it. Who is opposing it? Ironically, Rabbi Druckmann is opposing it, because he is considered too liberal in the eyes of Rabbi Sherman in the Rabbinic Court of Appeal, and Rabbi Riskin is considered, who is chief rabbi of Efrat, is considered too liberal in his eyes. This is a no-win situation. Now, what's at the crux of it? At the crux of it is, and you alluded to it, is the question, do we as Jews, do we as Orthodox Jews, do we as the State of Israel accept the notion that acceptance of the yoke of mitzvot in the traditional form is prerequisite for a legitimate conversion? Now, that's what the Chief Rabbinate insists on. If that's the case, there ain't going to be conversions. Just not going to be. Now, you find, Rabbi Mark Angel, you mentioned, when we started our conversation, you mentioned that the rabbinate has not been liberal or inclusive, etc. Rabbi Goren, when he was chief rabbi, was extremely liberal and inclusive when it came to conversions in Israel. The first chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, in his responsa volumes, relates to situations where mixed families, where the wife is not Jewish and the children are not Jewish according to halacha, came to him and said, we want the children to be considered Jewish, but it's clear that we are not going to be observant. And the rabbi is asking, should we convert them? And Rabbi Uziel says, the court should not ask them if they are going to be observant, and it is mutar umitzvah legayer otam afilu im אנחנו יודעים שאינם עתידים לקיים את כל המצוות. It's permissible and it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment to convert them even if we know that they are not going to be fully observant. So the debate is not between radical liberal Orthodox sources and mainstream which rejects this notion. The debate is much more serious than that, and both views have their place in the tradition. What I'm suggesting is giving the control to the chief rabbinate is not giving the control to Orthodox norms. It's giving the control to fundamentalist extreme circles against a valid, legitimate stream in Jewish Orthodox tradition which awaits being released, and Rabbi Riskin and Rabbi Mark Angel and Rabbi Avi Weiss and others are legitimate expressions of that Orthodox halachic voice. So the notion of the chief rabbinate being able to dictate who is a Jew is going to close the gates of conversion altogether. This is not just anti-democratic in the sense of Israel recognizing freedom of marriage and equality, it is anti-Jewish because we have a historic challenge. There are 350,000 plus Israeli citizens from the former Soviet Union who were born to Jewish families where the grandfather or the father was Jewish. Their number increases each year by about 5,000 because they have children. If we are not going to be able to offer them a gate that's accessible, that's open, that's embracing into the Jewish fold, whom are we kidding? We are going to increase intermarriages because people will marry, regardless of what the chief rabbinate is saying. And when you speak about Jewish peoplehood, do you for a moment consider the state of Israel being at the heart of the Jewish people, telling the majority of the children growing up in the Jewish community in America, you ain't Jewish or you ain't Jewish enough for us? Is that going to be enhancing a sense of Jewish peoplehood? We can't afford to allow the chief rabbinate to decide who is a Jew, and we can't afford to allow the chief rabbinate to decide for Israel who is legitimately a rabbi. That will alienate, and does alienate, American Jewry. Just the other week, Stuart Eisenstadt spoke about it in a press release of the Jewish Public Policy Institute. This is something that the American Jewish Committee has now spoken about, again, through Orthodox leadership, such as Dov Zakheim, such as Dr. Stephen Bain. This is not something that divides Orthodox from non-Orthodox, it divides fundamentalists from non-fundamentalists.
I need to press you just one more moment. because everything you said is something I emotionally gravitate towards. And none of that, it's much more than that. I think what you express is the fundamental sense of what the Jewish people must be, and not only must be, are, what they are. And I've also argued for a long time on Shalom TV, the kind of approach you express, I consider to be rabbinic. That if you understand the Judaism that's expressed overwhelmingly in Talmudic and rabbinic sources, the kind of repressive, closed orthodoxy that the chief rabbinate represents has no basis in authentic Jewish thought and rabbinic thought. It is a modern bastardization of something that happened for purely political and reasons of self-interest. Having said that, you didn't address one wrinkle, and I want to end the wrinkle, and I want to hear what you have to say. When you talked to Shlomo Riskin at the AJC Global Forum, one of the things that was discussed is what constitutes ritually a proper conversion. And I'm going to ask Uri Regev, if there is a reform conversion in America of an adult non-Jew, non-Jewish male, and the reform rabbi decides that there is so much good intent in this individual that he cannot say to this individual, if you do not have at age 45 or 35 a brit milah where the foreskin is actually removed, no drop of blood, but we want real circumcision. And the individual says, it's just not something I can do. And the reform rabbi says, okay. And there are reform rabbis who will do an adult conversion without circumcision. Is that, from Uri Regev's point of view, a valid Jewish conversion that you want an embracing orthodoxy in Israel to accept as an acceptable form of conversion?
I'm personally more on the traditional side on this issue, and I think that recognizing that most males that I am aware of who came to convert were circumcised, it is an issue of shedding of a drop of blood. I would like to see reform rabbis...
that's somebody who is already circumcised.
I'm saying most males are circumcised.
Okay, by the way, the Russian community you spoke about in Israel, they're not circumcised. This is an issue for them.
Well, it's interesting because actually the Ministry of Religious Affairs that administers the conversion of Russian Olim through Rabbi Druckmann's conversion authority, etc., is providing them with funding and the service of adult circumcision.
And many of them choose it, but many do not. And I'm only saying to you, there is a reality. The reality is that in the Reform movement, circumcision is not always part of the ceremony. And what I heard Shlomo Riskin say to you is, there are certain things that I need from the Reform movement. One is, regardless of what we mean by accepting the commandments, I found out you chose, in my mind, the easiest of all. The real hard one is, do you require circumcision? And if there are Reform rabbis who are prepared to do a circumcision without a conversion without circumcision, or are prepared to marry a woman who was divorced who had a ketubah but never received a get, and there are Reform rabbis who marry that woman all the time, do you consider that to be a legitimate problem that not the ultra-Orthodox, not the chief rabbi, but your mainstream Orthodox rabbinate in Israel, Orthodox rabbis in Israel, would say to you, Uri, I have a problem with that. How do we resolve that problem? And one last thing. In America, there have been attempts to create, inside America, in given communities. Denver was one of the pilot communities where the Orthodox, conservative, Reform rabbis all got together in one sort of bet-in, and it didn't matter who. They would accept conversions, but it would be done inside this communal bet-in. It broke down over time.
Why did it break down? Do you recall?
No, I don't recall at the moment.
Then let me suggest.
Let me just. But the whole idea was that there would be minimal standards of both observance, meaning ritual observance, and it would include mikveh and brit milah, as well as some form of Jewish education. It did not require an acceptance of the Taryag mitzvot, that you didn't have to accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, a 613 mitzvot. You didn't have to promise, you were going to observe all the laws of ritual purity, let alone the Shabbat. But even in America, this has been a wedge issue among the movements that has prevented communities inside America from creating a communal sense of conversion, which has been to the detriment of American Jewish life. And I'm asking you, to what extent do you see this as a legitimate problem, or do you say, look, if there are Reform rabbis who do conversions without Brit Milah, or will marry a woman without a get, the state of Israel still should accept them as complete Jews, and there should be no problem?
So let me suggest the following. First of all, as an Israeli Reform rabbi, we have very clear standards, both in terms of marriage and in terms of conversion, that are binding on all the members of the Israel Council of Progressive Rabbis. They include Milah and Tvila for male converts and Tvila for female converts. We don't have access to many of the mikvaot in the country because of the control of the Rabbinate, and therefore alternatively, arrangements are made to have them immerse, do the Tvila
you
in
require
the
this?
sea. We require.
Okay, but philosophically, that's rather small of you, isn't it?
1 second. I'm saying there are set criteria that guide the Reform rabbis in Israel. They include Milah and Tvila in conversion.
So one thing's a guideline, but you require it. They're not
require
it. It's not a guideline. It's a requirement.
Moreover, if a conversion is performed by a member of the Reform Rabbinate in Israel that does not conform to that member, according to the decisions of the Israel Council of Progressive Rabbis, will be suspended from membership.
Do you understand that it's exactly the same process that you're railing against in the Chief Rabbinate?
No, that is
you
not.
You just have a...
Yes,
it is not. You just have a broader swath.
Wait. What I'm about to suggest is that I make a distinction. Internally, the Reform Rabbinate in Israel felt, along the lines that you have suggested before, that we are respecting a traditional framework for conversion that includes Milah and Tvila, and we require get in the case of a woman who was married religiously and is now requesting to remarry. Having said that, as a lawyer who represented cases before the Supreme Court, the State of Israel does not impose halachic requirement on conversion, but accepts that practices of conversion are different in different denominations, different communities, and what the Supreme Court has said is a conversion which is acceptable to an established community, Jewish community in the US, let's say, is going to be accepted by the civil authorities of the State of Israel. And therefore, I don't stop to check whether the individual who came to me as a lawyer has been circumcised or not. I satisfy myself with a legitimate, authentic conversion certificate signed by rabbis in good standing, coming from a community which is a recognized, established Jewish community. I will tell you, we had instances of conversions done by fly-by-nights rabbis. There was a rabbi who advertised in the Yellow Pages conversion in 8 hours. And we, as a matter of policy, refused to accept these conversions as far as our legal services were concerned.
Which means you wouldn't do what for them?
I wouldn't represent them, demanding that the Israeli authorities recognize them, or I would not go to court when the Israeli authorities turned them down.
Why would the Israeli authorities turn them down?
Because at this point, the Ministry of the Interior is checking the authenticity of the rabbi and the authenticity of the process. There is a fine line that distinguishes between someone who advertises commercial conversions in 8 hours in the Yellow Pages and a rabbi of an established community that is operating as part of the organized reform or conservative movements. So the distinction I'm making is between my being an individual Reform rabbi as part of the Reform Rabbinate in Israel, and I will suggest to you, you know, the late Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz, in his book Not in Heaven, Lo B'Shamayim, he suggested that if Reform rabbis were to accept the notion of Mila and Tvila, the Orthodox Rabbinate, b'diavad, should be, after the fact, should be accepting these conversions as valid.
But wait, isn't that a wonderful position to take?
Of course.
That's the right position.
Of course.
Right.
And what I'm suggesting is that many of the Reform rabbis that I know, had there been this give and take, like in Denver, had there been this willingness to accept under certain reasonable conditions, I believe those Reform rabbis that I know and have spoken with would have been willing to tighten, so to speak, their requirements. Now, Denver broke down because the Orthodox rabbi who was involved in the process buckled under pressure from fundamentalist Orthodox circles in New York. The interesting thing
and really
is...
withdrew. He withdrew.
And therefore the whole process
Correct.
broke down. Now, I know, I've come across, and it's been years since I read it, but I've come across an article that he wrote in which he explained how pressure was applied on him and he withdrew, but he assumed that it would be renewed somehow, and he said, had I known that this would never reassemble, would never come back together, I would not have and should not have withdrawn. So it's sad, and I think that it's not too late to try and recreate this model. I think there would be openness on the part of many Reform rabbis that I know, but in a reality in which basically the chief rabbinate is saying not just to them, it doesn't make any difference if you require Mila and Tvila. We don't even accept Orthodox conversions that require Mila and Tvila. Whom have you got to talk to?
Which is why, again, the Orthodox rabbinate is viewed as corrupt and is in some way a shanda in and of itself, and why it's not only someone like you, but many Orthodox rabbis sit at this table and say to me, it's sad, but the Orthodox rabbinate should be disbanded. Uri, we're going to have to pause. This discussion is fascinating. It is wonderful to have you on this at this table, and we'll continue, okay? You are seeing the fabulous Uri Regev, President and CEO of Hiddush, an organization dedicated to freedom of religion for Israel. This is part one of the discussion. I hope you're with us for part two. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.